People who grew up rich but turned out poor. What is your story? Parents quit a good job cause my dad got tired of the daily repeating pattern. It bored him too much to spend his life on it. That's how we went from lower middle class to homeless. My dad decided he needed a break for a while. He quit his job, disappeared for a year or so, and left us 3 kids, all minors, to fend for ourselves. Our mother had died years before, so we didn't have another parent to rely on. No drugs or alcohol was involved in his decision either. He just stopped being a parent one day. We were really well off in Korea until we moved to America. It seemed like a piece of cake for a family like mine to start life anew with enough financial backings. My father had worked hard for his family. In the first 2 years of our life in America, my parents were scammed by shady Korean immigration lawyers. Twice. Blew all of their savings and emergency funds. We started from rock bottom again. I remember skipping 2 meals a day so we could have food to go around everyone. I also remember pulling the plug on the refrigerator because what's the ducking point if there's nothing in it? We don't look back or talk about those times anymore. My grandparents were very wealthy so they bought my parents a house and basically supported my family, even paying for my school tuition. I wasn't aware of this. Because of this my parents were lazy and never really had jobs. They were always at home and I didn't find any of this unusual. We had extravagant vacations and I remember being given everything I'd ever asked for. But my parents wasted the rest of their savings on appearing rich, buying fancy jewelry and clothes for themselves and shit, racking up credit card debt. Then they'd host parties for friends in expensive restaurants and I'd feel so angry because back home we'd be eating nothing but canned food. It honestly scarred me so much that my only goal is to become financially stable, and I plan to stay employed without ever retiring because I don't want to be like them, jobless and stupid. Ironically, they've probably taught you financial responsibility really well, despite not understanding it themselves. I grew up in a wealthy part of the United States, and everyone I went to school with had wealthy parents. It's amazing how many of these children are now mediocre at best and not high-income earners. There was an assumption that if they simply went to college, graduated and got a job, they'd be as successful as their parents. When they weren't, they felt the world was unfair and became apathetic. My parents' neighborhood has homes in the $2 to $20 million range and about 50% of the houses now have adult children in their 50s living with 80-year-old parents. I have a friend in her 50s, who her life plan is to just wait for her inheritance. From various stories I think she'll end up getting in the tens of millions, but for now her apartment looks fit for a recent college grad. She works just hard enough to get by until then, sometimes needing her dad pay her bills. You know my sister? My dad was a millionaire, cheated on my mom left him, he had a mental breakdown, lost everything, still trying to get her back 10 years later. This is a beautiful poem. My dad had a stroke, and the complications from that, the medical bills, and my mother becoming his caretaker led us to eventual homelessness over the course of 5 years. This was in the late 90s, early 2000s. By the time I was 18 we had almost no assets because of medical costs. I became a teacher, and am now lower middle class and working toward middle class. My wife works for a non-profit which helps people attain financial stability. My dad had a stroke too, 3 years ago. I'm 17 now. Me, my 2 siblings and mom take care of him. We spent every savings we had for dad. But still, mom works very hard to treat us without a change. Love you, mom. Not me, but my ex. Her family owned a retail business and was fairly wealthy. At some point I think the number I was given was about $30 million. I repeatedly suggested that they set some money aside. I'm not an expert but small businesses can go under in the blink of an eye and it just made sense that they put away some savings just in case. Every time I brought it up I was told that I was being stupid and that real business owners don't save anything. They invest all of their earnings back into their business. Eventually I stopped bringing it up so they'd stop making me feel like shit for being concerned. And eventually after that our relationship ended. Last I spoke to her they were in the process of losing everything. The rise of online retail had absolutely ruined them. Until I was 10, my family seemed to have an ideal life. Beautiful house, in a very wealthy beachfront town, expensive cars, summer camps, and everything else a kid could want. My dad was a dentist and my mom was just starting work as real estate broker. She said her money was fun money. Dad paid the bills. But, unbeknownst to us, Dad didn't pay the bills. He was living a double life with our babysitter. They even had their own house. My parents split and weeks later, the bank took our house. We, my mom and us 3 kids, were out on our asses. My dad has taken whatever was left of the money, not much, and destroyed my mom's credit with bankruptcies and delinquencies she didn't know about. We struggled for many years and had lots of help from family friends. There were many birthdays and holidays with no gifts and lots of pasta for dinner. My mom could stretch a dollar pretty well since she had grown up with not much money. Now, 30 years later, my mom has become successful financially through lots of hard work. My dad is still with my old babysitter. He retired. He was forced to sell his practice because of lots of bad business practices, and is now working a minimum wage job and living in near poverty. Karma is a witch. I grew up rich. I wouldn't say I'm poor, but I don't live near as well as my parents. I grew up in a house which Zillow has now valued at $5 million in a very wealthy area. My mom never worked. My dad had an office and employees, and besides my mom, 3 ex-wives. My grandmother and great-grandfather came from extreme wealth. And really, it just turned out that my dad, though he was pretending for years to run a business, have an office and be a big important person, never actually made any money. All of it was drawn from a trust that had been set aside for him, and finally when it went dry, it was over. When my parents passed I inherited about $13,000. Meh, that's life. I have 2 siblings that roam the earth thinking there's still something they can capitalize on from all this, some privileged bank of connections they can make withdrawals from. But I've accepted that I'm just ordinary folk. Life doesn't owe me anything. Went from very well off to middle class. Grew up in Peru. My family was involved in government and acting. We appeared in a few shows. My mom was the face of a detergent brand. My sister was the face of some brand of cereal. I was doing commercials weekly. Being well off in a Latin American country was dangerous in the 90s. Still is. You have no idea. My mom had an armored car. We had shared guards with the other houses in my small block. We got followed all the time. Robbed at gunpoint. Moving to America to be safe meant losing it all and starting over. We cried in the plane. My mom even worked at Subway with my sister so we could get by. Now we live a nice secure life in Florida and I wouldn't go back. I was born into what pretty much was poverty in Eastern Russia. Moved to Australia with my mum where she met and married my dad. They started a business when I was about 9 or 10 which took off, and I clearly remember suddenly having a lot more nice food. For example, mum started buying bread from the bakery and no longer bought those plastic cheese squares. I also was suddenly signed up for art and dance classes. They bought a bigger apartment around this time and sent me to an expensive private school while continuing with the extracurriculum activities. I remember mum kept trying to take me shopping, which I always refused because when I was little we never bought anything, so I felt bad asking for things. Then dad lost his business and mum's business also took a hit, so they went from both incomes to essentially half of hers. I was living in uni at this time, so I was definitely a student and living on a budget, but a main thing I noticed was how stressed they had become and how they no longer had dinner parties. They are doing better now, but I would say they are more middle class. I think it affected my younger brothers more since they grew up during the wealthy period, while I still remember mum not being able to afford things like grapes and yogurt. Grew up rich in Pakistan until my mother got ill and made a string of bad choices in her business. Her business partner took off with the money. Went from rich to homeless. Luckily my father still had his well-paying job, so we could slowly start to rebuild. There was a lot of loan to pay back, which my father and mother managed. Mother started from scratch again. Whereas I moved out to Germany on a loan from friends to study further and currently am doing my PhD, which doesn't really pay much, but to be honest I don't care as long as it is enough to feed me and I get to do what I love. Have a few friends from Pakistan. Their stories for ending up in the US are always amazing. Sorry that happened to you and sorry educators don't get more pay. Cocaine is a hell of a drug. I'm honestly surprised most addicts can manage to get a hold of some every day. I work overtime at a decent paying job and I still couldn't afford that shit. The secret ingredient is crime. But for real, I don't know a single addict, and I've met my share of them, who didn't turn to crime at least sometimes. Mostly it was theft, but really desperate junkies will do robberies or even worse. Drugs really make you lose your shit. Lost a fair amount of friends from school to that shit. My dad had a midlife crisis when I was in high school and left his family and job to move across the country to marry his lover. He still helped pay for some of our college, still graduated with debt, but no emotional support, no connections, no leg up on anything. After such an asshole move, I don't know if I could possibly have accepted any of that from him anyways. I am probably a little better off than most still, but I don't live in a 15,000 square ft house like I grew up in. Exact same for me, I'm just still in the college part of life. My dad's love still hasn't left her husband and kids, and he refuses to pay for anything because he bought her a $50,000 engagement ring and $2 million house. My family was upper middle class. I grew up in McMansion. Came out of the closet back in 07. Parents disagreed and I ended up homeless for 6 months. Even after I found a stable living situation, I was still paycheck to paycheck up until a few years ago. Emotional trauma aside, the entire experience ended up being really humbling. I hated every minute of it and I'm still surprised I never ended up a statistic, but being poor helped me learn to be self-dependent and how to talk to people. My stepdad managed a casino and my mom was a really well-known real estate agent. Before they separated, their combined salaries was in the millions. My stepdad was very good with saving money and my mom was not. They split up. My mom proceeded to pay cash for a house in an upscale neighborhood. Bought a Porsche, a large truck, dirt bikes, computers, and everything else she wanted that my stepdad told her no for. She started dating young guys, and would pay for them to go to Aruba, the Bahamas, Dubai, etc. She was living a very carefree life. Originally I didn't take work or school seriously as a teenager because I was essentially spoiled. I had a terrible work ethic and I knew my college was going to be paid for regardless. Then the housing market collapsed in 2007. My mom lost her clients, her couple dozen investment houses she purchased, and had no income. She had to sell all of her material possessions, her young boyfriend left her, etc. She took her last $300,000 and opened a very niche store which failed after a year. She filed bankruptcy. I joined the military and left with $37 to my name. I had to learn work ethic. I had to learn how to learn. But overall I've had a very successful career so far. My mom married a doctor to stay afloat and still always talks about how she's going to make lots of money again to buy us all houses. I grew up in a family doing pretty well financially until my dad fell off a building, destroying his back exactly a couple of days before my mom gave birth to my youngest brother. They were both in the hospital for a long period of time, my dad especially. All this formed a chain-like couple of events. Dad couldn't work anymore but the hospital bills kept coming. Mom couldn't work enough to deal with it, also just giving birth she was not in perfect health. Someone had to take care of the baby as well. I wasn't old enough to be left alone with a newborn baby. That was the beginning. Now I'm older and I'm content with not being rich wealthy, and I tried helping them as I could after starting working right after I finished high school. Now the pandemic happened and we are left without a job. I feel so powerless not being able to help. My dear future millionaires, I hope you liked this video and are not going to make the same mistakes. Take care of your loved ones, stay frugal, and never forget to smash the like button, and subscribe.